You do not get to start fights in my hallway and then stand there like nothing happened, Principal Daniel Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the late morning noise as he pointed directly at Malik Carter, who had just stepped back from a cluster of lockers, shoulders still squared from the sudden movement. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering once as if the building itself hesitated, and the surrounding students shifted just enough to widen the circle without anyone fully stepping away. A cracked phone lay face down near Malik's sneaker, its screen reflecting a thin strip of light from the window at the end of the corridor. Ethan Cole stood a few feet away, one hand pressed to his cheek, breathing uneven but steady, eyes fixed somewhere just past Malik rather than on him. Malik blinked once, then again, as if trying to catch up to a moment that had already been decided for him. His fingers flexed at his sides before settling still. "Sir, he started, the words quiet, not defensive, just present. Whitmore did not look up from the scene he had already assembled in his head. "Save it. Office. Now." The assistant dean appeared at Malik's elbow without urgency, but with certainty, a hand hovering just close enough to guide without touching. Conversations along the hallway thinned into murmurs, then into something flatter, observational. Malik inhaled slowly through his nose, jaw tightening for a fraction of a second before releasing, and gave a small nod that no one had asked for. He stepped forward, past the broken phone, past Ethan, keeping his eyes level, while behind him the bell rang, sharp and indifferent, folding the moment into the rest of the day. The administrative hallway felt narrower than it had a minute ago, the air cooler, the hum of the ventilation louder against the quiet. Malik walked half a step behind the assistant dean, his pace steady but not rushed, the rubber soles of his sneakers catching slightly on the polished tile before finding rhythm again. A trophy case ran along the right wall, rows of gold plates and glass shelves reflecting fragments of movement as they passed, his own reflection slipping in and out between football plaques and debate medals. He glanced once, not at himself, but at the small printed labels beneath the trophies, reading them without really seeing them, then looked forward again. A door opened somewhere behind them, a teacher's voice drifting out mid-sentence before cutting off when it recognized the direction of their movement. Malik adjusted the strap of his backpack higher on his shoulder, then lowered it again, as if the weight had shifted without warning. His hand hovered near the zipper for a second, then dropped. At the end of the hall, the front office door stood propped open with a metal wedge, sunlight spilling across the threshold in a sharp rectangle that stopped just short of the reception desk. The secretary, Mrs. Dalton, looked up as they entered, her pen pausing above a stack of attendance forms. She did not ask a question. Her eyes moved from the assistant dean to Malik, then back to the forms, but her pen did not resume writing right away. Malik stopped where the assistant dean indicated, just beside a row of molded plastic chairs bolted to the floor. He did not sit immediately. He shifted his weight once, then again, like he was recalculating something small and precise, before lowering himself into the chair at the end of the row. The plastic creaked faintly under him. On the wall across from him, a digital clock ticked from 10:42 to 10:43, the red numbers blinking once as they changed. Malik watched the second digit for a beat longer than necessary, then looked down at his hands. There was a faint gray smudge along the side of his thumb, graphite or dirt, he could not tell. He rubbed it with the edge of his sleeve, not hard enough to remove it completely, just enough to dull it. The assistant dean spoke quietly with the secretary at the desk, their voices low, words indistinct, but every now and then a name surfaced clearly enough to carry. Malik's last name landed once, then again, each time followed by a brief pause that seemed longer than it should have been. A student passed by the open doorway, slowing just enough to glance in before continuing, the heel of their shoe clicking twice on the tile. Malik's gaze lifted toward the doorway, then dropped before the student could look back. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded worksheet, edges worn soft from being handled, and smoothed it against his knee. The paper bent slightly where it had been creased, refusing to lie flat at first. He pressed it down with both hands, held it there for a second, then released. The crease remained, lighter but still visible. He did not try again. From behind the closed office door down the hall, a muffled voice carried through, firm, measured, unmistakably Whitmore's, speaking to someone else now, the cadence unchanged. Malik's shoulders lifted with a slow inhale, then settled back into place as he exhaled, his posture straightening by a fraction, as if resetting something only he could feel. The clock shifted to 10:44. This time he did not look at it. The office door opened without a knock, and the shift in the room was immediate, almost practiced. Mrs. Dalton straightened in her chair before looking up. The assistant dean stepped half a pace back, and the low murmur near the desk cut off mid-word. Principal Whitmore walked in with a folder already open in his hand, eyes scanning the page as he moved, not slowing, not looking around. Someone from the front desk slid a clipboard toward him before he reached the counter, and he signed it without breaking stride, pen moving in a quick, confident line before being taken back just as smoothly. Malik remained seated, but his gaze lifted, tracking the movement for a second longer than he meant to before dropping to the edge of the worksheet, still resting on his knee. The crease he had flattened earlier had curled slightly at one corner. He pressed it down again with his thumb, slower this time, then let his hand rest there a beat before pulling it away. Whitmore did not address him right away. He spoke briefly with the assistant dean in a tone that stayed even, low, and final, like each sentence was already agreed upon before it was spoken. The assistant dean nodded once, then again, writing something down without asking a question. Malik's name was said again, clearly this time, followed by a short instruction that did not require confirmation. Across the room, a printer started up, the mechanical rhythm filling the space for a few seconds before spitting out a single page. Mrs. Dalton stood to retrieve it and brought it directly to Whitmore, bypassing the stack of forms she had been working through earlier. Malik noticed the way her steps were quicker now, more deliberate, like the room had shifted into a different tempo that he was not part of. He adjusted his posture, sitting a little straighter, then realized it and eased back by an inch, settling into something more neutral. His foot tapped once against the base of the chair, a soft plastic knock, then went still. Whitmore closed the folder and finally turned, his attention landing on Malik not with curiosity, but with completion, as if the decision had already traveled ahead of him and arrived first. Malik held that look for a fraction of a second, then glanced past him toward the open doorway, where another student paused, then kept walking without stepping inside. When Malik looked back, Whitmore was already moving toward the inner office, gesturing once with two fingers toward the hallway beyond. The assistant dean stepped in again, closer this time, indicating that Malik should follow. Malik rose, a half-second slower than expected, the chair legs scraping lightly against the floor before he caught it and lifted instead. He adjusted the strap of his backpack again, this time more carefully, making sure it sat flat against his shoulder, then stepped forward. As he passed the desk, the printer's tray still held a second sheet that had not been collected, its corner lifting slightly in the air from the vent beneath it. Malik's eyes flicked to it, then away, and he continued down the hall, the sound of his footsteps falling in line behind Whitmore's, just out of sync. The inner office was quieter, the kind of quiet that made small sounds carry farther than they should. Whitmore moved behind his desk and set the folder down in a precise line with the edge, adjusting it once with two fingers until it sat perfectly square. The assistant dean remained near the door, pen ready, eyes lowered to the notepad. Malik stopped a few feet from the chair in front of the desk, waiting for the signal to sit. It came as a brief motion, barely a gesture. He reached for the chair, pulled it back an inch too far, then corrected, easing it forward before sitting down carefully, knees aligned, hands resting loosely on his thighs. Whitmore opened the folder again, scanning the top page, then flipping it with a controlled, practiced motion. "You understand why you are here," he said, not looking up, his tone even but firmer than before, each word placed with intention. Malik's gaze shifted to the edge of the desk where a second sheet lay partially tucked beneath the folder, the corner visible enough to show a timestamp printed in small, bold font. His eyes lingered there for a fraction longer than necessary, then lifted toward Whitmore, then back again. His fingers pressed lightly against his knees, then released. A small pause settled into the room, not long, but noticeable, like a skipped beat in a steady rhythm. Malik drew in a quiet breath, the movement visible only in the slight rise of his shoulders, then said, "There are cameras in the hallway." The words came out steady, but a half step slower than they might have otherwise, as if they had to pass through something first. The assistant dean's pen paused midword. Whitmore's page did not turn. He closed the folder instead, flattening it with his palm, and looked up fully this time. The change was subtle but clear, his attention narrowing, his posture tightening by a degree. "We have a report," he replied, voice still controlled, but now carrying a sharper edge, the kind that redirected rather than invited. Malik held his position, then adjusted his hands, interlacing his fingers once before separating them again, placing them back on his thighs. "The footage would show what happened," he added, the second sentence arriving more evenly, though his foot shifted slightly under the chair, heel lifting and settling again against the floor. The room stilled. The assistant dean glanced up briefly, then back down, but did not resume writing. Whitmore's gaze stayed on Malik, unblinking, measuring. "We are not reopening every incident based on speculation," he said, each word spaced just enough to close the gap that had opened. He reached for a pen, aligned it with the folder, then picked it up again, a small, deliberate reset of control. Malik's eyes dropped for a moment to the edge of the desk, then returned, his posture straightening by a fraction as he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the movement contained and careful, as if holding the line he had just crossed without stepping any further. Whitmore did not reach for the camera logs. Instead, he slid a single sheet from the folder and turned it toward Malik, aligning it carefully with the edge of the desk before lifting his hand away. "Sign," he said, the word quiet, final, leaving no space for negotiation. The assistant dean shifted slightly by the door, not stepping forward, but no longer writing either, pen hovering just above the page as if waiting for a cue that had already been given. Malik's eyes moved down to the paper. The heading was bold, centered, the language dense but familiar enough to understand without reading every line. Suspension notice. Effective immediately. He did not touch it right away. His right hand rested on his thigh, fingers pressing lightly into the fabric, then easing, then pressing again, a small cycle that repeated once before stopping. The room felt tighter now, like the walls had edged closer without moving. Somewhere outside, a phone rang twice, then stopped. Whitmore remained still behind the desk, one hand resting flat beside the folder, the other holding the pen loosely between his fingers, not offering it yet. Malik leaned forward a fraction, enough to bring the paper into clearer focus, but not enough to close the distance. His gaze paused on the line where his name was printed, then shifted to the paragraph beneath it, scanning without fully reading. The assistant dean cleared his throat softly, not a prompt, just a sound that settled into the space and stayed there. Whitmore tapped the pen once against the desk, a controlled, measured motion, then placed it directly on top of the signature line. "We are not delaying this," he said, voice even, but now carrying a firmness that pressed outward. Filling the room. Malik's hand lifted, then stopped halfway, hovering above the desk. His fingers curled slightly, then straightened, then curled again, like he was adjusting to a surface he had not touched yet. He drew in a breath, held it for a second, then let it out slowly through his nose. "If the footage is checked first," he said, the words steady but quieter than before, not pushing, just present, then the report would not need to be corrected later. The assistant dean's pen lowered to the page without writing. Whitmore did not respond immediately. He picked up the pen again, rolled it once between his fingers, then set it down closer to Malik, reducing the distance by an inch. "You are not in a position to set conditions," he replied, each word spaced just enough to settle heavily, not raised, not sharp, but unmistakably final. Malik's eyes dropped to the pen, then to the line beneath it. His hand moved forward, fingertips brushing the edge of the paper, then pulling back slightly, as if the surface carried more weight than expected. He adjusted his posture, sitting a little straighter, then leaned forward again, this time more deliberately. The chair legs gave a faint sound against the floor, small but noticeable in the quiet. Outside the office, footsteps passed, slowed, then continued, the rhythm uneven, as if someone had hesitated just beyond the door. Malik's left hand came up to steady the page, pressing it flat. The crease in his sleeve caught on the corner, and he smoothed it down with his thumb, a small correction that took longer than it should have. His right hand hovered over the pen again, then finally closed around it. The weight was familiar, but his grip adjusted once, then again, before settling. He positioned the tip just above the line, not touching, holding it there for a second that stretched longer than the ones before it. Whitmore watched without moving, his gaze fixed, patient in a way that did not offer time so much as contained it. The assistant dean shifted his stance, transferring weight from one foot to the other, the fabric of his jacket rustling softly. Malik lowered the pen until it touched the paper, then paused. His wrist tightened slightly, then loosened. He lifted the pen a fraction, not breaking contact completely, then set it down again, aligning it more precisely with the start of the line. "This goes on record," Whitmore added, not as a warning, but as a statement, reinforcing what was already in motion. Malik's eyes flicked up for a brief second, meeting Whitmore's, then dropped back to the page. The contact was short, but enough to register the distance between them, not in feet, but in outcome. His hand moved, slow at first, forming the first letter with a careful stroke. The line was slightly heavier than usual, the ink pressing deeper into the paper before evening out. He continued, each letter measured, controlled, though the spacing between them tightened more than intended. The assistant dean resumed writing, noting the time without looking directly at Malik. Halfway through his name, Malik's hand slowed, the pen lingering at the end of a letter before moving on. He did not stop. The motion carried through, steadying as it went, until the final letter was completed. He lifted the pen, held it above the paper for a brief second, then set it down on the desk, not sliding it back, just releasing it where it was. The room did not change. Whitmore reached forward, pulled the paper back toward himself, and placed it neatly into the folder without checking the signature. He closed the folder with a soft, definitive motion, then aligned it again with the edge of the desk. "You will collect your things," he said, already moving to the next step, his tone unchanged, the decision complete. Malik sat still for a moment longer, his hands returning to his thighs, fingers pressing once, then flattening. He nodded once, a small, contained motion, then pushed himself up from the chair. The legs scraped lightly this time, a brief sound that he did not correct. As he adjusted his backpack strap, his hand caught the edge of the zipper, tugging it down an inch before he stopped and pulled it back up, a small misstep quickly corrected. He turned toward the door, the assistant dean stepping aside to give him space, the gesture automatic, practiced. As Malik passed, the assistant dean glanced at him, then away, the look brief, unreadable, but present. The hallway beyond felt brighter than before, the light sharper, the sounds of the school filtering back in with a clarity that had been muted inside. Malik stepped out, the door closing softly behind him, and for a second, he paused just outside the frame, his shoulders lifting with a quiet breath before settling again. Then he moved forward, the weight of the signed paper now out of his hands but not out of the space around him. The hallway carried on as if nothing had been decided behind the closed office door, lockers opening and shutting in uneven intervals, voices rising and dropping in fragments that never fully connected. Malik stepped into the flow without joining it, his pace measured, not slow enough to stand out, not fast enough to blend in. His hand stayed on the strap of his backpack a second longer than needed before releasing, then returned to it again, adjusting the position by an inch, then leaving it alone. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, one panel near the ceiling flickering at a steady rhythm that pulled his gaze up for a moment before he brought it back down to eye level. A group of students shifted aside as he passed, not dramatically, just enough to widen the path, their conversation dipping for a beat before resuming behind him. Malik's steps aligned with the pattern of the floor tiles for a few strides, heel landing at the edge of each square, then slipping half an inch off before correcting, a small recalibration that repeated once and then settled. He reached his locker and paused, not opening it right away. His fingers rested on the combination dial, turning it once past the number, then back again, slower, as if confirming the sequence through touch rather than memory. The metal door gave a soft click but did not open. He exhaled quietly, reset the dial, and tried again, this time pressing the latch a fraction earlier. It opened. Inside, the arrangement was unchanged, books stacked unevenly, a loose sheet folded between pages, a pen clipped to the edge of a notebook. He reached for the notebook, then stopped, his hand hovering just above it before shifting to the pen instead, adjusting its clip so it sat straight. A teacher's voice echoed from down the hall, calling for students to head to class, the tone firm but routine. Malik pulled the notebook out, slid it into his bag, then returned the loose sheet to its place, smoothing it flat with his palm. As he closed the locker, the metal edge met the frame with a slightly louder sound than intended. He held it there for a second, hand still on the surface, then let go. Across the hallway, a security camera sat angled toward the lockers, its small red indicator light steady. Malik's eyes moved to it, stayed for a beat longer than necessary, then dropped. His shoulders lifted with a slow inhale, then settled as he adjusted the strap again, this time aligning it more carefully across his shoulder. Down the corridor, the office door opened briefly, and Whitmore stepped out, speaking to the assistant dean in a low tone that did not carry. His gaze moved across the hallway, not searching, but registering, passing over clusters of students before pausing, just briefly, in Malik's direction. Not long enough to call attention, but long enough to notice. Malik turned slightly toward the flow of traffic, shifting his position so that the line of lockers broke that line of sight, then stepped forward, merging into the movement toward the next class. The bell rang, sharp and even, and for a moment the sound filled everything, flattening the edges of conversation, the scrape of shoes, the distant hum of the building. Malik kept walking, his pace steady, his eyes forward, and if you stay with this moment just a little longer, you might notice how nothing has changed and yet nothing feels the same. The corridor narrowed ahead, light pooling near the classroom doors, and Malik adjusted his grip on the strap once more, a small, precise movement, before letting his hand fall to his side. The second period bell had barely settled when a voice cut across the hallway from the direction of the main office, sharper than the usual announcements, but not amplified, just urgent enough to carry. "Hold on. Rewind that," someone said, and the tone was different from before, less routine, more precise. Malik had just reached the corner near the science wing when the assistant dean appeared again, moving faster this time, not scanning the hallway but heading straight through it. A few students slowed, sensing the shift without knowing why. Behind him, a security staff member pushed open the office door wider than usual, letting a slice of the monitoring room become visible for a moment, screens stacked in rows. One of them paused on a familiar stretch of lockers. The same angle Malik had glanced at earlier. The red timestamp in the corner blinked as the video resumed. On the screen, Ethan stepped forward first. The movement was clear, unblocked, his hand reaching, the phone slipping, his own momentum carrying him off balance before he collided with the locker edge. Malik was there, but a step back, hands not raised, not reaching. The sequence played again, slower. No contact, no strike, just a misstep that looked different when watched without the noise of the hallway around it. The assistant dean stopped mid-stride, turned halfway back toward the office, then looked out again as if recalibrating where he was supposed to be. Whitmore stepped into view behind him, not rushing, but no longer moving with the same steady rhythm as before. His gaze fixed on the screen, then shifted past it, out through the doorway, scanning the hall until it landed on Malik. For a second, he did not move. The assistant dean lowered the notepad in his hand without writing. Mrs. Dalton stood behind the desk, one hand resting on the counter, no longer sorting papers. The video looped again, the same moment repeating with a clarity that removed the need for explanation. A teacher passing by slowed, looked through the open door, then stopped completely. "That is not what the report says," she said, not loudly, but enough to be heard. No one answered her. Whitmore stepped forward, closer to the threshold, his posture still upright, but the alignment slightly off, as if something had interrupted the sequence he had been following. He reached for the edge of the doorframe, then let his hand fall without touching it. "Pause it there," he said, and the voice held, but the cadence had shifted, a fraction slower, each word placed more carefully than before. The frame froze with Ethan's foot mid-step, the gap between him and Malik clearly visible. The assistant dean moved back toward the office, not waiting to be told, already adjusting his path. In the hallway, the flow of students had thinned, attention pulling subtly toward the open door, toward the screen that was no longer hidden. Malik had not moved from where he stood. His posture remained the same, shoulders level, gaze steady, not fixed on Whitmore, not fixed on the screen, but aligned somewhere between them. The distance that had defined the moment earlier, between assumption and action, between report and result, shifted, not in words, but in what could now be seen. Whitmore looked at Malik again, longer this time, not as a conclusion, but as something that required a second look, and for the first time, the space between them did not feel settled. No one told the hallway to quiet down, but it did anyway, the usual noise thinning into something more selective, like people were choosing what to hear. Whitmore stepped fully into the doorway this time, no longer framed by the office behind him, but standing in the same space as everyone else, his presence still firm, but no longer setting the rhythm. He looked back once toward the monitor, then out again, measuring the distance between the image and the boy standing near the corner. The assistant dean moved closer to the threshold, not blocking it, just occupying it differently, his notepad now held against his chest instead of open. "Pull the full segment," Whitmore said, the instruction clear, but his voice carried a slight delay, like it had passed through an extra step before leaving. Inside, the security staff member nodded and began typing, the keys clicking faster than before, pulling up a longer clip. On the screen, the hallway widened, more context filling in around the moment, students passing, lockers opening, the sequence building into the same conclusion from a broader angle. A second monitor mirrored the feed, then a third, until the same footage was visible from multiple positions in the room, each confirming the same gap, the same lack of contact. Mrs. Dalton stepped out from behind the desk without being asked, her movement slower than usual, eyes moving between Whitmore and the screen, then briefly to Malik before settling again on the monitors. A teacher leaned closer to the doorway, not entering, but no longer pretending to pass by. "That is consistent across all angles," she said, more certain now, her tone carrying weight that did not need reinforcement. Whitmore did not respond to her directly. He reached into the folder he had brought out earlier, opened it halfway, then stopped, his fingers resting on the edge of the paper inside. He did not pull it out. Instead, he closed the folder again, this time without aligning it, leaving it slightly off-center in his hand. The assistant dean shifted his stance again, stepping 1 foot back, creating a clearer line between Whitmore and Malik, as if the space itself needed to be adjusted. "We need to correct the report," Whitmore said, not loudly, but with a different kind of firmness, one that redirected rather than imposed. The words moved outward, not just to the assistant dean, but into the room, into the hallway, into the small cluster of people now watching. The assistant dean nodded immediately, flipping his notepad open again, but this time the motion was quicker, less measured, his pen moving without pause. Inside the office, the security staff member marked the footage, tagging the segment, the timestamp flashing as it was logged. The system made a soft confirmation sound, a tone that usually went unnoticed, but now seemed to punctuate the shift. Malik remained where he was, his posture unchanged, shoulders level, hands at his sides. His gaze moved once toward the monitors, then back to a neutral point ahead, not seeking acknowledgement, not avoiding it either. A student near the lockers whispered something to another, the words too low to catch, but the direction of their attention had changed, no longer fixed on Malik alone, but moving between him and the office. Whitmore took a step forward, then stopped, the motion incomplete, as if the next action had not yet been decided. He adjusted his grip on the folder, then lowered it slightly, no longer holding it as a barrier between himself and the space. "Hold off on processing the suspension," he added, the instruction coming a fraction slower than the previous one, but clear enough to carry. Mrs. Dalton turned back toward the desk immediately, reaching for the keyboard, her fingers moving to halt the outgoing notice that had already been queued. The assistant dean paused his writing just long enough to glance at Whitmore, then resumed, crossing out a line with a single stroke before continuing. The hallway did not return to normal. It shifted into something else, not settled, not resolved, but no longer moving in only one direction. Malik adjusted his stance slightly, shifting his weight from 1 foot to the other, a small movement that brought him a half step more into the light from the overhead panel. Whitmore's eyes tracked that movement without intending to, then steadied again. He did not step closer. He did not step back. But he did not look away either, and the space between them, once defined by a single decision, now held multiple outcomes at once, none of them as simple as before. Whitmore stood at the edge of the hallway a moment longer, then turned back into the office with a decision that no longer waited. He opened the folder again, this time fully, pulled the suspension form out, and held it above the desk for a second before tearing it cleanly in half. The sound was not loud, but it carried. He placed the pieces down without aligning them, then reached for the keyboard at the front desk himself, not waiting for Mrs. Dalton. His fingers moved with less certainty than before, pausing once over a key before pressing it, then continuing until the system confirmed the record had been cleared. The assistant dean stopped writing entirely and lowered his pen, watching the screen as the status updated. "Return him to class," Whitmore said, not looking up, the instruction direct, already acted on. He stepped back from the desk, creating space where he had previously closed it. Malik did not move right away. He stood where he had been, shoulders steady, eyes level, then adjusted his backpack strap once, the motion small and precise, before turning toward the hallway. No one stopped him. As he walked past, the path did not widen the same way it had before. It held, then opened naturally, without hesitation. A student near the lockers shifted their gaze from the office to Malik and gave a brief nod, not exaggerated, just enough to register. Malik reached his classroom door, placed his hand on the handle, and paused for a fraction of a second, then pushed it open and stepped inside. Behind him, Whitmore remained in the hallway, no longer directing the space, watching as the door closed with a soft click that settled into the building's usual rhythm. If this moment stayed with you, share your thoughts, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and thank you for being here.